Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
If we look at the numbers of people who fled in late 1941 and early 1942, the COVID numbers pale in comparison. 17% of Calcutta fled in 17 days in late 41. 25% of Bombay was absent at one time. There were just empty, parts of Bombay just emptied out. Almost all of Madras went. Visakhapatnam was a ghost town. And Visakhapatnam fled in January. Before January, 50 or 60% of the population of Visakhapatnam had gone. So we're talking about huge numbers. One would imagine that this would be reflected in more than small single columns which say special trains are going to be run to let people go and so on and so forth. So there were no human interest stories about the flap. And I looked not just at the Hindu, I looked at the Statesman, I looked at the Indian Express, I looked at the Mail, I looked everywhere. And there's nothing beyond small reports and the odd editorial, usually in the British newspapers, the Mail and the Statesman.
The Great Flap of 1942 is a history of a neglected period between December 1941 and mid-1942, when all of India was caught up in a panic due to the British administration's mistaken belief that Japan was on the verge of a full-fledged invasion. It was a time when the Raj became unduly alarmed, when rumors about Japanese prowess and British weakness spread like wildfire, leading to an exodus of Indians and Europeans alike from both coasts to safer regions inland. This book demonstrates quite astonishingly that the Raj cynically encouraged the exodus and contributed to the repeated cycles of rumour, panic and flight. It also reveals how the shadow of the Japanese threat influenced the course of nationalist politics, altered British attitudes towards India, and charted the course towards independence. The title refers to an expression used by British bureaucrats in India that traces a broad narrative arc, starting with the Japanese attacks in Southeast Asia. The assault on Malaya, the conquest of Singapore, the bombing and eventual occupation of Burma, and the Japanese Navy's foray into the Indian Ocean are examined in the light of the tremendous impact they had on the people of India. The author, Mukund Padmanabhan, is a distinguished professor of philosophy at Kriya University, prior to which he was editor of The Hindu. He will be in conversation with historian and columnist V. Sriram. This episode is adapted from an event that took place in June of 2024 at the Bangalore International Centre.
It gives me great pleasure to be in conversation with my dear friend Mukund. Mukund did a conversation on my book 2 years ago at the Chennai International Centre, and I only hope that I do justice to his work. People are still talking about the way he had created the questions and conducted that particular event, and I hope I can do justice to it. The Great Flap of 1942 is a fascinating work because it takes us through this journey of what happened during the Second World War and an episode that eventually never really comes to take place. I'll begin with a reading, the first page of the book, the introduction. In the early hours of 7th April 1942, 3 Japanese aircraft were spotted over the Bay of Bengal by an aging Atalanta on a routine reconnaissance mission from Madras. The hulking plane was fondly referred to as the Victory Bus because it was used for patrols every day, or the Lazy Susan because it chuntered along at a genial pace. Essentially a passenger aircraft that served the British Empire's colonies in Africa, it could carry up to 9 passengers. Some Atalantas found their way into the British Overseas Airways Corporation in India. From there, they made their way into the Royal Air Force, each fitted with a single .303 machine gun. So long in the tooth, the Atalanta could have been easily extracted out of the sky by the 3 Japanese aircraft, whatever their make or type. But oddly enough, it was the Japanese pilots who veered away after studying the aircraft intently, apparently frightened by the 4-engined plane's size. The story that made the rounds in Madras was that the Japanese turned and fled in terror, suspecting that it was some sort of new secret British weapon. If true, this was possibly the only instance until then of the British scaring off the Japanese in World War II. It was invariably the other way round, with British India cowering in fear over an impending Japanese attack, a dread that had set in when Japan entered the war a few months earlier. So that's how the book really begins. And so, Mukund, would you like to comment on why the book?
Why the book? Well, let me twist the question. Maybe how did this book come about? This book came about largely because I grew up with this story. You know, my mother was one of those who fled, like almost everyone in Madras. As you know, in the book, I suggest, and this is something that surprises even people who know about the exodus in Madras, that conservatively 75% of the population fled, possibly up to 90% fled at that time. And as I grew up, it was not just my mother, it was everyone I knew who had a father or a grandfather had left. And so somewhere at the back of my mind, I knew that there was a story waiting to be written. While I was a journalist, there was no time to write it, but I do remember many, many years ago having a free afternoon, spending it in the British Library, looking for documents, actually communication between Governor Hope and Condon Smith, which were part of the fortnightly reports, and bringing them back, but then not doing much with it. So it was only after 2019 that I sort of got around to doing the book. And then what began as a story, essentially, I thought it would mainly be about Madras. I discovered was, Madras was just a small part of it, that the panic and the Great Flap was pretty much pan-national. People fled interior places, people fled, unlikely places such as Ahmedabad and Delhi. People fled Calcutta and Bombay in large numbers, of course. But people also, there were strange incidents in towns like Ooty and Kodaikanal. So the flap is, one part of the story of the flap is just a story of a largely unmapped exodus of people. So that's one part of the story that kind of interested me. And as I worked on it, I discovered that it needed to be broader. The narrative arc had to be greater. So I tried to map what was happening in India with the Japanese advances in Southeast Asia. And of course, I tried to make the case that the events of 1942, the momentous events of 1942, which were essentially the Cripps mission and Gandhi's call for quit India, which reams and reams have been written about, need to be at least analyzed and explained in the context of what was happening, because all this was happening when Japan was on the rampage in Southeast Asia. And I tried to suggest that the impact it had on the nationalist movement is something that perhaps hasn't been given the due it has. So essentially, that's a long-winded way of answering the question. But
I would entirely agree with you with the fact that this becomes more a pan-Indian work or even a pan-empire work, if I can call it that, because Madras, is, as you say very rightly, is just one city in this whole narrative. It also surprises me because the way we Chennai people or Madras people have always taken pride in the fact that in the First World War, we were the only city to be bombed. In the Second World War, we were the only ones not to be bombed. And we keep talking about it all the time as though the rest of the country didn't exist. There was nothing else happening anywhere else.
There was one reconnaissance plane that came in October 1943 and dropped a few bombs in the harbor. But, the flap was over by then.
And apparently that was a day of power failure, so nobody knew about it. And the newspapers didn't even report it the next day.
Well, single column in the Hindu.
That's right.
Just for record, yeah.
Which takes me to the next question, which is one consistent takeaway from this book particularly, and I hope that others also will make a point to note that, is the racism that comes through right across. Because today, 75 years after independence, I think there are lots of people who look back on it with a kind of a rosy hue. They keep looking, the British, etc., etc. And suddenly you find that when it came to evacuation, when it came to protection, it's always their people who mattered first, while everybody else was kind of thrown into the front line. It keeps coming back in various pages in this book.
Yeah, I think it comes across in two ways. One is that the Indian army, or Indians in the army, formed the majority in World War II. They were larger in number than the British or the Australians or the Chinese, for that matter. And when the Indians went there, there was a kind of racism that existed in places like Malaysia that they themselves were shocked by. And there is a theory that the formation of the INA, which happened pretty early, as soon as the Japanese took some control of northern Malaya, was helped along by the fact that Indian soldiers worked under pretty racist kind of conditions. So, how much it was a contributory factor is a question you can debate. There's a historian called Hugh Toy who says it's probably exaggerated. But there's no doubt that the way British people treated Indian officers, and the examples of this in the book, just nudged them a little more into the Japanese hands. And the Japanese had, a very, very good strike rate. The very few people held out. I mean, some people held out for a while and then they joined. Some held out altogether, but most people just went along. I mean, and this was remarkable that the people who surrendered to the Japanese in Malaya and Singapore were all willing to sign up for the Japanese effort under Mohan Singh, it was then, to sort of rid India of the British. So that, I think, racism does play a role. And as far as evacuation, yes, I mean, there is the evacuation of Penang, where the European population just slip away, and so does the white army men under the cover of night, leaving the population at the mercy of the Japanese. And there's a mention of this. The great historian Chris Bailey of Cambridge actually calls it the most shameful moment of the British Empire.
And what is even more scary is the fact that the enemy didn't know that the whites had left. So they kept bombarding the town and killing the civilian population, which had no means of communicating to them that the army had already gone away. And finally, it's a journalist who takes control.
Well, an editor called, a Tamil editor called Manikasati Sarvanamuthu, who may be of Sri Lankan origin. And yeah, so he has this idea that let's get the Union Jack down and put an Indian flag up. But that doesn't stop the bombing, because I don't think the Japanese noticed that. But it's a few days after they realize that the army has left, the Europeans have all left. So they just walk into Penang and take it over, and then subject the population to quite a bit of trouble.
The other aspect that really comes across when we read The Great Flap is how few of the Europeans were actually there and how they were able to control an entire empire. You keep referring to, just a handful of Englishmen in every location. And we seem to have been very happy and content with somebody administering us with just such few numbers right through during that time.
That's true. I mean, this is a point that's made before, that the men who ruled us were not very large in numbers. And I think that's true of the flap itself. I mean, these were people who had, by 42, access to great resources. So they hired a lot of Indians, but there were not that many Europeans at that time.
But that story was a phenomenal one. I hope I'm not giving away much of the book, but the racism was to such an extent that when an Indian officer would get into the swimming pool, the whites would all leave immediately. So finally, one of them solves the problem by getting all the Indians to come and stand around the pool, the Indian officers. And there is this English woman. Every time she enters the water, they enter in along with her. She immediately comes out. They all come out along with her. Then when she gets in again, they all jump in again till the lesson is reached that, we can keep doing this forever. We speak about the level of chaos and the fact that they didn't anticipate. But did they really underestimate the Japanese to that extent? And that underestimation seems to have continued even now when you look at accounts of the Second World War as written. There's very little that is really mentioned about the Japanese, apart from Pearl Harbor and the fact that they invaded Malaysia and Singapore. The focus seems to be forever on Hitler and Mussolini and not so much to an extent on what the Japanese did.
I think they're worried about the Japanese. I'm not sure if they underestimated Japanese military strength in a general way. What they got terribly wrong, particularly the people in India and in England, they believed that once the Japanese had launched the attack on Malaya, which they launched synchronously with Pearl Harbor, as you know, the objective of Pearl Harbor was very limited. Take out the American fleet so that we have the run of Southeast Asia and its resources, tin, rubber, oil, so on. So, I mean, I make this point that, lots of films have been done about Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese were really interested in Southeast Asia. They were only interested in neutralizing the Americans so that they could do what they wanted over there. So what the British got wrong is when they attacked the North of Malaya, they thought that for many reasons, geography being one of them, because there's a thick spine of sort of forest that runs to Malaya, that there's no way the Japanese could get south. And so even as they came down, Hope, others, Linlithgow, others were telling Indians that, look, as long as Singapore is safe, we're safe. I mean, Singapore was the unimpregnable fortress. As long as Singapore is safe, we're safe. And the Japanese just came through with such speed, and then Singapore fell by February 15th, 1942. That they didn't anticipate. They didn't anticipate at all, partly because, as lots of people know, that most of Singapore guns were facing south towards the sea. No one expected an attack on Singapore from the north.
British policy had always been to look at the northwest. They always thought Russia was the big danger. And now you suddenly had a new force coming in from the southeast. Did it take time for them to?
Yeah, essentially, if you look at British writing at that time, the threats to India were from the northwest and maybe from the northeast because the Japanese were in China already. No one had anticipated a threat emerging from Southeast Asia. Linlithgow's biographer, his son, claims that he did. But the truth is that...
I think it was filial love more than anything
I think that probably was an exaggeration. I mean, his son, has this passage where Linlithgow, Viceroy Linlithgow, by the way, is lying in his library, poring over maps and worrying about Japanese attack on Singapore. But essentially, they were surprised that it came from this quarter.
You mentioned Linlithgow, so I think we may as well move on to the next question. There are two people who keep coming back in this story. One is Lord Linlithgow, who is the Viceroy, and the other is Sir Arthur Hope, who is the Governor of Madras. Later in history, neither of them is judged in any favorable light, and perhaps rightfully so. But in this work, they come across as fairly contrasting characters. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, as you know, Nehru famously described Linlithgow as a rock with a rock's lack of awareness or something like that. And
he's supposed to have been only interested in insemination of cows.
he was a cold
bull and cow were the two things that,
unfeeling kind of
maybe he'll
man.
find an echo today.
And Hope, we became aware of this only about 20 years ago. Hope was recalled in the mid-40s as governor of Madras because he just borrowed money from all kinds of people for his betting. He used to like betting on horses. He borrowed money from Indians as well, and also from Madura courts and the head of Madura courts and so on. And this scandal was hushed up at the level of the king, the prime minister, everyone else, secretary of state. And he was asked to go back. And the Times then of London sort of looked through the archives and found these stories about a couple of decades back, which is probably why Hope never left papers. And, I wish he had, because this book would have been much richer if he had left papers. So there was that. There was this corrupt man, or at least a man with great weaknesses who was prone to borrowing money. That's one side of him. But there's another side, which I discovered on reading the communication between him and Linlithgow. And I've read Linlithgow's communications with various heads of various provinces, Orissa, Bengal, Bombay, and so on. And the funny thing about Hope is that he is perhaps the boldest in the way he writes to Linlithgow. He tells Linlithgow, look, be honest about what's happening. Because, when Rangoon is bombed, there's so much panic here. They lie about the casualty figures. They're also giving the casualty figures 2 weeks afterwards. And this was a typical war stratagem. So Indians learned that the Andamans fell on March 23rd, only in April, early April. So, and he's telling Hope that, look, tell the truth. Hope is telling Linlithgow, because if you don't tell the truth, rumors abound and then panic abounds. So essentially, exactly what pans out in this book, because what happens is there's panic, that breeds rumors, that breeds flight breeds further rumors, that breeds panic. So there's this endless cycle of that keeps going on, which is what exactly happened in 42. And Hope is one of the few people who sort of tells Linlithgow, tell the truth. And Linlithgow disagrees with him. He thinks British policy is of, being economical with the truth is better. Yeah.
In fact, there is a passage, I think, that where it's reading on that. This portion about how quickly the Japanese were able to come in and take charge of the entire region. Would you like to read that?
Yeah, so I think a bit of context. So what happens is, even though the Japanese have no plan of invading India, they send out Nagumo, who's the hero of Pearl Harbor, into the Indian Ocean. He comes in with 6 aircraft carriers, string of cruisers and destroyers, and bombs Colombo and bombs Trincomalee, takes out the Hermes, which is one of an aging aircraft carrier. And what he's looking for is to destroy the British Eastern Fleet. The British Eastern Fleet is in Singapore. Singapore falls on February 15th. And so they move the Eastern Fleet to Trincomalee in Ceylon. What Nagumo doesn't know is that by some luck, Somerville's ship, Admiral Somerville, who's the head of the Eastern Fleet, is actually in the Maldives in a place called Adu Atoll, where they have a secret base. At the same time, there's a B fleet headed by another Vice Admiral called Ozawa, which comes into the Bay of Bengal. So this is this area off the coast of what is Orissa now, broadly. And he has 1 light aircraft carrier and many other ships. They split into 3 southern group, central group, and northern group. And their brief is to just take down merchant ships, any shipping in the Bay of Bengal. And this story actually hardly gets play even in the Indian press. So there are a lot of people I met who know that, for instance, Vishakhapatnam and Kakinada or Kokanada were bombed, but don't know that Ozawa was running rampage and that people were washed up on the Orissa coast. So the flap does deal with this. So this passage is really about Fleet B, which is Ozawa's fleet, which sails into the Bay of Bengal. And so I'll just read a bit of that. So on 1st April, this is 1942, Vice Admiral Jisabura Ozawa led his fleet out from Mergui in southern Burma westwards into the Bay of Bengal. His Malay Flo's fleet was smaller than Nagumo's, built around the light carrier Ryujo, 6 cruisers and 4 destroyers. Ozawa lingered near the channel that separates the Andaman and Nicobar Islands for a couple of days, probably waiting to synchronize his attack with Nagumo's. Nagumo is doing his dirty in Ceylon. On the morning of April 4th, he headed in the general direction of Orissa on India's northeastern coast. By then, the Andamans were already in Japanese control. It was a foregone conclusion that the Bay Islands could not be defended. At the crack of dawn on 5th April, bombers lifted off the Ryujo on a search and destroy mission, sinking 1 ship, disabling another, and damaging a third. Before sunset that evening, Ozawa divided his naval force into 3 groups, which headed towards different points of the Indian coastline. Ozawa himself was part of the central group, which made up the Ryujo and 5 other ships. The 3 groups were fairly spread out, the distance between the southern and northern ones as much as 400 miles. It was easy pickings. The following day, the northern group sank 7 ships in a little over 3 hours, starting with the Norwegian tanker Elsa, which was on its way from Madras to Calcutta with a belly full of kerosene. Not long afterwards, a Japanese biplane located 6 merchant ships sailing close to the coastline. There was an attempt to scatter, but the Japanese warships caught up with the group and sank all ships. Together, the 3 groups sank at least 20 ships and damaged 3 more in the space of 2 days. It was an attack of international dimensions. 11 flew UK flags. 3 each of the remaining 9 were of Netherlands, Norway, and the United States. The merchant ships were completely helpless against the might of Ozawa's force. And, there's one man called Stanley Salt who actually survives this. And he describes how they would sink the ships and just watch these guys clamber onto boats and not shoot at them, but sort of leer over their destroyers, grinning at them as they were struggling. And so at least 500 people from the ship wash up onto the store. And so that's one of the stories of the flap. Again, I just want to digress here a bit. So that's the military side. But there are things that happen during that period. I make the point the Exodus was not about Madras, not about Calcutta, which some of that has been recorded already, but pretty much pan-Indian, and their numbers in this communication prove that. But very few people know, for instance, and I was in Hyderabad at the Lit Fest where, that Lit Fest was devoted to Oriya writers and intellectuals and so on. There's a group of them at that session. And so I actually asked how many of them knew that the capital of Orissa was moved from Cuttack to Sambalpur. And not one of them did. So similarly, the secretariat in Cochin was moved to Trishur inland. So all these things are sort of emblematic of the panic that prevailed there. And this communication between the Orissa governor and Lilithko saying, if the Japanese come, Cuttack is going to be completely threatened because, it's almost like an island in the Mahanadi and exit points are problematic. And so he's in a panic and he just says, I want to get out. And so he moves. The entire secretariat is moved. So there's stories like this which suggest that our obsession with independence, stories of Cripps and its failure and our Quit India call and the arrests afterwards, somewhere the attention on these events, looked at through the prism of sort of nationalism, the flap has got lost in this. And also, you might argue that, it never happened. So it was a non-event. I tried to make a case that it was a non-event that actually impacted us in ways that we've not probably fully recognized.
Of course, you might have known that the Madras Port Trust, which should have been by the sea, shifts to Ooty,
Correct.
of all places. Yeah. So during the flap, which is, I think, the farthest away from an ocean.
Yeah. So you're right. So Madras is the only city in India where an actual advisory is issued saying, if you have no business here, leave. The governors of the Bombay Presidency and Bengal are actually mulling over this, issuing such an advisory. What they're worried about is essentially that if they issue such an advisory, then it'll be a good thing because a lot of people that the British call inessentials or useless mouths or ineffectives will leave. But what they're worried about in these two cities, because these are industrial centers, is that the people who are essential, those engaged in war production, particularly in Calcutta, they will leave too. So for them, they actually tacitly encourage this exodus. And that's another story in the flap. And if you look at the communication that Linlithgow has, he says very much and quite flatly, without, not even a word of contriteness, that this is our policy. We want useless mouths. And he uses the words useless mouths more than once. We want useless mouths to leave, but we need to find a way of keeping those we want here. So this is what essentially he has in mind. Madras issues that communique at the end because of false information. A Southern Command informs Hope that there is a huge naval fleet that is going to make landfall in what is now the coast of Tamil Nadu, south of Madras, around April 14th, and they change it to 15th. So they're saying the Japanese are going to be a full-fledged invasion. This is nonsense, because by 15th, the Japanese, Nagumo and Ozama, already finished with the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal, and they're going back because they have other battles to fight in the Pacific with the US, which is now regrouped and is posing a challenge to Japan. So there's no threat at all, and this is completely wrong information. And so on this basis of the wrong information, he makes the government scatter. So you're right, the Port Trust goes, the High Court goes to Coimbatore for the Tamil cases, and the Telugu cases, they go to Anantapur. They're split. The Accountant General office comes to Bangalore, Salem, all over, not just Ooty. They're just all over. Madanapalli, they just move all over.
There's that very nice story about Sir Sidney Wadsworth and his wife.
Correct.
Setting out in a car.
They set out in a car, and then they go to Anantapur. The records haven't come. So they'll go up to this place called Horsley Hills, and they spend a lovely 15 days and they just drive back. So the flap meant something quite different for a man of his stature. But for many ordinary people, I think it meant much more than that. My mother's family spent a whole year away, 1 whole year in Coimbatore before they came back. I learned that some people never came back. They just went back to their native places and didn't come back. So,
you talk about the flap in such evocative terms in the book, and yet you mentioned to me that the newspapers hardly covered it at that time. Would you like to comment on that here?
Let's look at the exodus during COVID and the kind of saturation coverage that it got. If we look at the numbers of people who fled in late 1941 and early 1942, the COVID numbers pale in comparison. 17% of Calcutta fled in 17 days in late 41. 25% of Bombay was absent at one time. They were just empty. Parts of Bombay just emptied out. Almost all of Madras went. Visakhapatnam was a ghost town. And Visakhapatnam fled in January. Before January, 50 or 60% of the population of Visakhapatnam had gone. So we're talking about huge numbers. One would imagine that this would be reflected in more than small single columns, which say special trains are going to be run to let people go, and so on and so forth. So there were no human interest stories about the flap. And I looked not just at the Hindu, I looked at the Statesman, I looked at the Indian Express, I looked at the Mail, I looked everywhere. And there's nothing beyond small reports and the odd editorial, usually in the British newspapers, the Mail and the Statesman. So I often wonder that maybe we didn't do a kind of human interest journalism at that time. I mean, we might think of this was a golden age, but maybe the journalism at that time focused more on statements, on press releases, on what it regarded as news. And people fleeing in such large numbers didn't make up news. Maybe we didn't do enough human interest reporting. And that's what I think surprised me when I was researching this. There is more in the odd private diaries. If there are two major sources, it's Linlithgow's secret communications and other communications with the governor and their replies, and in the private diaries of British bureaucrats or Indian bureaucrats, which anyway, Jairam and others, which are lying in the British Library. So this has been essentially recreated, apart from the fortnightly reports and everything else. This has essentially been recreated from there. So I've tried to use very little of personal accounts simply because memory is unreliable, particularly when it's so far away. So my mother's story is mentioned here, but I've tried to avoid using personal voices.
So that brings us to sources. Would you like to take us to, where you went in order to?
Well, I first went to the Madras archives and, you go through the index, there's a geo on this, there's a geo on that. There's a geo on, for instance, on the animals in Madras Zoo. There's a geo on evacuation. There's various geos. And then I kept asking, I want this, I want that. And I couldn't find a single document. They said after a while, all the documents had been moved to the secretariat. So I actually went to the secretariat, went up to the public secretary and said, look, this is what the archives say. They say, sorry, we have no documents here. So I drew almost a complete blank at the Madras archives.
As so many others have done.
As so many others have done. And so essentially it was Delhi. It was London, the British Archives and the National Archives at Kew. I did spend quite some time there, sort of furiously taking notes. And also, I think, tapped into a couple of other sources. One of the things, and I find this is not used enough, I'm nobody here to lecture a proper historian, but there's a wealth of discussion in the Central Legislative Assembly and in the Council of States. And if you're looking at this period, then I think the evacuation and everything else, these are issues that come up in the discussions at the time. And the great thing about it now is it's all online. You can access them. So that was another source. And I also did, and I found this also fascinating. There are little bits in the book, the Corporation Archives of Madras, because that's actually related like a he said, she said, like a Hansard, interventions. And it's quite remarkable that in Madras in the 40s, there was just so much awareness of what was happening globally. Madras, well before the Japanese entered the war, donates 10,000 rupees to Singapore, the Corporation of Madras, which is elected Indians, essentially. Some nominated white people, but essentially the elected body. Donates money to Singapore saying, you need to be secure from the Japanese, well before the Japanese even have attacked Pearl Harbor or Malaya. So there's a lot of awareness and a lot of interesting discussion I found in the Madras Corporation. Some of this is mentioned here. So these are the various sources I looked at. And of course, being in the press, I think, I used a lot of newspapers, which was, I think, sometimes the most difficult and painful part because you have to find these single columns in the middle of somewhere. But after a while,
middle
you
of
learn
bad
to look,
newsprint as well.
Well, after a while, you learn to look at, which page to turn to, and then it becomes a little easier. So there was that as well.
What about Japanese sources?
Good question. From what little I read, there's some 2 or 3 Japanese sources mentioned, but you're right. By and large, this is absent. I gather that they destroyed a lot of it. This is what I read when before they surrendered. And whatever little that remained, and I'm not sure how relevant that is, that was then taken to the United States for a while. And then I believe there's some discussion. I'm not aware of this fully, but this is what I read. There is some record of Ozawa's operations in the Bay of Bengal because it's a part of military shipping history. And I've referred to that. I've used that to decide that, okay, maybe it's this merchant ship he sank at this time rather than something else just by deduction. But you're right. There is very little in the book about Japanese intent or, this is what we set out to do, and it's not there. I don't think it's been done before. Whatever little I've read on the flap, I have not read Japanese sources. So if it's out there somewhere, I think somebody should be looking at it.
There are two parallel threads. One is of the war and the flap and everything. And the other is Gandhi, Bose, Nehru. Would you like to comment on it? Because particularly in the light of what you have written.
Yeah, so I tried to analyze the impact of the war on the nationalist movement. I mean, starting with 1939, when Lindithgow declares India at war. As soon as Britain declares it's at war with Germany after Poland, Lindithgow sits in Simla and then he gets on All India Radio and says India is at war too. And the Congress, of course, is very miffed because they've not been consulted and so on. So that's one section of this. But I try to suggest that as the war progresses, the Congress gets deeply divided. Of course, the story of Bose, everyone knows. You know, he's sidelined in the Congress. He goes away to Germany and then finally gets to Japan and then
it was news to me that Bose was not the founder of the INA. It's only on reading your book that I always thought that he was the man.
No, he wasn't. I mean, it was Pritam Singh, Mohan Singh, and then Rashbihari Bose. After Mohan Singh falls out of the Japanese, Rashbihari Bose, who was a part of the Ghadar movement, is recalled from Japan and then asked to take it over. But by then, the Japanese know that this is a holding operation for Bose. Bose is already in Germany. He's in Berlin. And then he, gets to Japan and then finally comes to Singapore. But by the time he declares, the provisional government of free India and, he declares war on Bose declares war on the United States and Britain rather grandly from Singapore. The Japanese...
Oh, we Bengalis are like that.
I'll duck that one. But the Japanese are not the naval power that they were. In 1942, they rule the waves. There's passages about Churchill just saying, this Japan has just a free run of the waves. But by the middle of 1942, after the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway, the US has kind of neutralized the Japanese army. So yes, they're in possession of territory, but they're not the force that were. And so when they finally attack India in 1944, I know that they were, the Battle of Kohima was, the British regard it as one of their major victories and so on. But they're essentially fighting a force that has already been considerably weakened by that time. So I don't get into that part of it. I only deal with the beginning, which is 1942. Nehru is quite clear. Nehru is ideological. He is against the Axis powers to them, and particularly after, Hitler attacks the Soviet Union. Nehru by nature is left. So he's quite clear that his heart is with the Allies. Gandhi, soon after war is declared, he supposedly sobs when he meets Lindithgow, saying, he can't imagine a ruined parliament building, Westminster, because he studied there as a student. So his sympathies seem to be with Britain. But as the war progresses, and this is again an issue I deal with, he is accused by people, including Nehru's biographer, Gopal, and including, not accused, or at least he's said to be sympathetic, or at least he believes that Japan will win the war. There are people like Azad, Maulana Azad, and others, and Nehru himself has said this at one meeting, that Gandhi was an ideological way Nehru was. I mean, he saw this in terms of this. He also, in his eyes, there was a moral equivalence between aggression and counter-aggression. And he was telling Lindithgow all the time that if you counter-attack, you're as bad as the Nazis. For him, the response to aggression was sort of passive violence. He was telling all kinds of people, Abyssinians, Jews, give your lives up. He was telling Britons, give up your homes, let Hitler take your land. So which the Congress found, or at least large sections of the Congress found completely impractical advice at that time. So there was that, the fact that he saw this in less ideological terms than Nehru did. He also believed, I think, that Japan was winning the war. Cripps thought he did. Wavell thought he did. Nehru has suggested this. Azad definitely thought he did. And so he ends up being accused of being pro-Japanese. Or in fact, Gopal actually says he adopts a pro-Japanese position. And he then writes in the Harijan why he's not pro-Japanese. He's forced to defend himself. But Gandhi does change his position in the end. And this is, again, something that I don't see in a lot of nationalist writing on it. Gandhi is saying, I'm not going to support this war because any support of this war is a form of violence. Nehru is saying, we'll support the war, but not as slaves, give us independence. Rajaji is saying something else because he goes to another extreme, and I'll leave that out for the moment. And of course, Bose is with the Japanese. So this is how structures out. But Gandhi, towards the end, does a little bit of U-turn. In fact, he explains, saying that all of you may be surprised doing this. So this is there. He allows international troops. He says, I'm okay with international troops being on Indian soil. And then, of course, Mr. Shankar Singh actually writes to Nehru saying, you must have really worked on him to do this. And Gandhi then tries to explain why he's had this change of heart, not very convincingly, because his position all along was, look, if the British go, the Japanese won't attack us. They've got a problem with you, not with us. And he actually goes as far at one time of trying to draft a resolution saying, we have no problem with Japan. We're willing to negotiate with them, which horrifies Nehru. And then that draft resolution is worked on a couple of times, and then Nehru's hand, it's changed. So this is another aspect which I think probably needs to be studied a little further. The fact that the war did actually divide the Congress. It brought them all together in the end, all under Gandhi at the end, because suddenly in 42, he's asked the British to go. I mean, he's the most moderate congressman, and Bose is upset with him that, has been upset with him that he's not pushing the British out. Nehru is impatient. He's not willing to call mass satyagraha because he says, I don't want to embarrass the British because they're fighting a war at this time. And suddenly in 42, he's changed. And some people think he's changed because in 42, around the middle of 42, I mean, it was in August that Quit India call takes place. But by May, he's starting to get a little more aggressive in his statements, a little more direct, saying, I think the British should go. And the big question is whether this has to do with a belief that the Japanese would win the war or not. I put it there as a possibility that can't be discounted because we don't have the proof on this.
Where did Jinnah come into all this?
Well, I mean, Lindithko was softer to Jinnah during the war. I mean, there were sections of our polity that were sort of broadly supportive of Britain and the war effort. So I deal essentially with the Congress. I felt that was my interest at the moment. I mean, I don't deal with some of the other parties that were broadly supportive of the British war effort. Or characters. I mean, I don't mention Ambedkar, for instance, because Ambedkar joins Lindithko's the Viceroy's Council in 41. So I don't get into that kind of space.
Looking back and considering the fact now that there are two wars raging at different places, do you think the flap has any lesson for all of us as a world at large?
I don't know. I mean, that's a big question. I think it needs a better mind than mine to answer it. I think it's sort of established that non-events are events too in history, and they can influence the course of history. I think my entire attempt in this book is to show that how a non-event played out. There's a sort of dystopian kind of futility to the whole thing. I mean, imagine an entire town evacuating and nothing happening after that. Or imagine a capital shifting where the Japanese have already gone away. So there's stories like this, and they're bizarre stories in the flap, and sometimes it's almost fictional. I mean, there is this one story, if you'll give me a minute, I'll mention, because I was just delighted when I found this in the British Library, thanks to the private papers of one ICS official who's in Delhi, and the brother of the poet W.H. Auden, who's a geologist, and Bhatnagar, who then becomes a big cheese in the Indian scientific establishment. They go to him and they say, look, we've manufactured this black with this substance. And if you burn the substance, it will cloud your important buildings with black smoke. So Japanese cannot spot this. And this is in Delhi. And this is when there is absolutely no threat of Delhi being bombed, simply because a bomber cannot take off, or any fighter cannot take off from Singapore, Malaya, come all the way to Delhi and go back. There was no technology that allowed it at that time. The tanks weren't big enough. So they actually say, okay, do it. So around Army HQ, which is South Block, they put these little braziers and they burn this black tarry substance, and it's a complete washout. So there's stories like this which are just emblematic of the panic. And to me, they're just as interesting, and they're revealing of people. The British who fled, the Americans who just fled Kodaikanal in panic. Kodaikanal, 300 Americans sort of rush one day in complete panic, thinking that the Japanese will attack Kodaikanal. The story is, again, got lost somewhere. It's thanks to an editorial in the Mail and some little thing somewhere else that, one has been able to piece this together. It's stories like this that sort of interested me in the idea. I think there's sort of a rich vein of stories like this, almost fictional stories. And that's one side. And the more serious side, and those were the two chapters that took me the longest to write. I write fairly quickly, so it doesn't take me too long. But those two chapters actually took me quite some time to write, which were the political chapters, because I didn't want to make a mistake and I didn't want to get something wrong on an area that's just been so much of writing, the nationalist movement and so on. So there's one side, which is a sort of slightly more serious side to the book, which is the political side. And there's slightly more fictional side about all this crazy stuff that happened in India, which we seem to have forgotten about.
Including the killing of animals.
Including the killing of animals in Madras Zoo, yeah. That's
Thank you so much.
Thank you very
You
much.
have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.